So there was also a new model released from Anthropic, Claude for Opus, which we knew was coming. We had heard that it was going to be this, really tremendous coding model, which apparently it is. I still don't know how to code, but I really do feel like I want to set some time aside this summer to try and figure out vibe coding. Like I feel like if I not that I want to build that many things myself, but I want to know how to vibe code because it
You gotta
feels
put
like
that in your second brain.
yeah, that is a second brain topic for sure. I don't and figuring out how to go about it, but I do think it's, like, the kind of thing that you could dedicate some number of hours, like, over a few weeks and learn just to understand it better because it seems now like such an important part of the conversation. Who was it? Oh, was it we'll get to the DoorDash podcast in a moment, but one of the reasons I think we're seeing the models do, so well at coding and so well at, math and science is because the engineers who are building them, like that's what they're more interested in, right? There's not a bunch of like lawyers in the
Like,
lab, right? So
how do we
like
make it write a better brief?
But Claude 4 Opus is apparently, like, really excellent at complex tasks. It can maintain its performance over extended periods of time. It has deep reasoning, which we have already seen, obviously, from the OpenAI models and from the Google models. And it can do, really long running tasks, and it can enhance agents' capabilities. There was a bunch of, like, chatter about safety, like, there was some social media hubbub about how Claude 4 Opus, will turn you in if you're doing something immoral or illegal, or it wasn't clear exactly how it was defining immoral or illegal, and what exactly it meant about turning you in, like, who was it turning you in to? But I think all of that was a little bit more, talk than, reality, although it sounds like there was some serious concern, and that might be why it took us longer to see this model from Anthropic than we saw similar models from the other labs, about how it was performing oversight for bad actors. And Anthropic has always been focused on safety, right? That's sort of been how that's the lane in a way. I mean, I think they have lots of lanes, but that's one lane that I feel like they've scoped out for themselves. So there's been some interesting conversation in many podcasts that you and I both listen to about whether they were pushed to release it too early or they took too long, and that's been kind of interesting to follow. But have you tried Claude 4 Opus yet?
Only briefly, like, not enough to really dig into what makes it different or special, but I found the conversation about the safety to be interesting because, there are conflicting reports as to why Anthropic was formed, that it was formed, the public story is that it was formed to be more safe version of ChatGPT, and then there were interviews that came out later that said, like, they were just trying to develop different products faster and get them to market, and that tension seems to raise its head again and again of sort of on the one hand, it feels like their models are a little bit slow to catch up with ChatGPT, and
Yeah.
my perception has always been that that's because they're more careful about the release and it takes them a little bit longer even if they have the technology. But then I think these stories that are emerging from internal researchers are sort of suggesting that they are really being pulled to release things maybe before people are comfortable with it. And I imagine
Yeah.
internally, I mean, knowing absolutely nothing about the internal workings there, but it must be a difficult culture to lead if you've attracted people with the idea of developing safe AI, but you are under pressure to compete with this timeline because adoption is so important. And if people are already using something that's 3 months ahead of you, it's
Yeah.
hard to catch up. They do great research, I think. I
They
I think
do.
they have really great research reports.
Yeah, in fact, I feel like we learn more about how the models are behaving or why they're doing what they're doing from the Anthropic research team than any maybe just because I haven't dug into I'm sure there's really good research everywhere, but their research has broken through for me about, the kind of work they do to try and understand why the models are doing what they're doing. I think we're going to talk briefly about the Dwarkesh interview of Trenton Bricken and Sholto Douglas, who are two Anthropic researchers. And one of the interesting things they said on there, maybe you remember, I think they said like these AI systems are grown, not built. Do you remember that line? It was like I was like, "Oh god," and but it resonates because it's like, having grown some humans, like I've grown some humans, and I can't tell you why they do things differently. Like I fed them all the same, they had the same rules, they, had the same bedtime, they like all had to play music instruments, they had to do sports, they all had the same like, and yet like I've grown these, like, totally different humans, and if I had to try and figure out why this one thinks this way and that one, reasons a different way, it would be really hard for me to do, and that was such an interesting, like, way he put that. I don't know which one of them said it, but that they're grown, not built. I was like, "Ooh, wow."
I love that.
Yeah, super interesting.
Well, maybe why don't you, set up the Dwarkesh interview because you pinged me over the weekend that you were listening to it, and then I listened to it. It was super interesting.
Yeah, so I don't I listen to Dwarkesh's interviews whenever I can because I think he's so smart, and I will say that whenever I listen to an interview that he's doing, I often have to stop, rewind, and listen to some things over and over again just to make sure I'm following it, but these 2 researchers from Anthropic, he had, like, a wide-ranging conversation. I mean, I think it was a couple hours at least, maybe closer to 3. Just, not about, I mean, obviously, they talked about Claude 4 Opus, and then also, like, where the world is going, like, and what, sort of what happens next. One of the most interesting parts of the interview was, how would you advise, a a young person who was starting out a career, or even somebody who had started a career, like, what do you do with those, like, sunk costs if this technology is gonna completely change the profession that you were headed into, right? And it was just a super interesting conversation, and those 2 are very, very smart, and I found them actually thoughtful. And there was the one thing that I think I texted you about or emailed you about or something was this, statement by Sholto Douglas. He said, "Even if algorithmic progress stalls out and we just never figure out how to keep progress going, the current suite of algorithms are sufficient to automate white collar work, provided you have enough of the right kinds of data. Compared to the TAM of salaries for all of those kinds of work, it is so trivially worthwhile." And I'm not saying like I'm surprised that even where we are right now, we could automate all white collar work. I mean, I'm building a second brain, and a lot of people are. I'm automating myself right out of a job today. But it, but that the only that the barrier is just gathering the right data and then focusing on the different like tasks or jobs or functions that you want to automate. Like that, again, coding has come first because that's bringing so much um, value, to engineers in labs, right? Like the sooner they can train AIs to code, then they have teams of AIs like building faster, right? And getting faster to where they're all headed. But that just means, like, they haven't turned to law yet, right? Like, I mean, I'm not saying they I don't know when they will, but that was pretty, a pretty stunning statement. You might have picked out other ones, but that one did stick with me.
No, it's kind of funny because I hadn't read your quote that you pulled out before we got on the podcast, and I think I pulled out the same insight from the same part of the conversation when they were talking about, "Could it do your taxes?" And they
Yeah,
were all like,
that was hilarious.
laughing and
Yeah,
but could it do it by the end? I thought it was just so funny, like,
I know.
Dwarkesh is just like, "But how about by the end of 2026?"
Yeah.
Because it's just, like, the most painful thing to do, so and it seems like something they should be able to do, right? Like, it's, like, just information that you're putting in.
Exactly, what they kept saying, like, "Yeah, I can do that as long as someone's interested enough to, like, make that the focus of their work," right? It's just like whether there's an engineer at some lab who's like, "Let's do taxes," you know?
But that's what made me so excited about the conversation because it feels like, on the one hand, we're in this weird moment where we were talking about this before we started recording. Like, you talk to so many people who aren't thinking about this at all, haven't tried a frontier model at all, but all the technology is sitting there now, ready to use. Like, if it never progressed beyond this, and it seemed to me like the bottleneck is just the number of humans to throw at all of these different challenges, and I think that's so cool. There's so much low-hanging fruit, and even you have this in cab rides. You'll talk to somebody I'll talk to somebody at neighborhood pizza night, always lawyers, because 'cause I'm, like, surrounded by lawyers, and they're all stressed out about work and different parts of what they're doing, and I'm like, "Why don't you just build a GPT and upload, all the case documents to it and get your associate, that you just hired who's stressing you out up to speed?" And they're like, I have no idea what the words are coming out of your mouth, like, "Eat your pizza and stop talking to me about GPTs." But, like, I don't have the bandwidth to go in and do that, but it excites me that, like, it really is not that difficult to
Yeah.
do if you choose to do it, and we all have problems that we need to solve in our personal lives and society-wide, that I thought that was, like, a very exciting insight from them.
Yeah, I, totally agree, and I mean, I think if we haven't said this in recent episodes, I wanna say it again, like, if you're literally just starting today, you are, I don't know, a couple of weeks away from being just about where anybody else is. You really can, like, catch up in no time, and be, like, where everybody else is and figuring out what the ways are that this can make a difference in your life, your practice, your work, so
And just to put a fine point on what we were saying before about people asking either of us just because 'cause we're, like, fanatics about using this, like, "Help me do this." You can log on to ChatGPT today and say, "I went to pizza night with this crazy woman in my neighborhood who keeps talking about GPTs for litigation. Like, what does that mean, and how would I build one?" And it will tell you. And we'll go in a future podcast and talk about how to do that safely and ethically, but it's not difficult to just ask the AI for instructions on how to use it. The other thing I took out of that, which kind of relates to your "these things are grown, not built" a little bit, but and I'm putting words in their mouths. This is not how they said it because they used a lot of really cool lingo that I don't understand, and they said it really quickly. But this idea that from as outsiders, we see all these slick product announcements, and we're sort of like, "Why can't they get their act together? Why can't they develop a strategy?" And they were sort of like inside these labs, it's, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of people just researching and trying to figure out what's possible,
yeah,
and it's a little bit chaotic, right? Like, it's
yeah.
not and that makes total sense to me, and it's a little bit unreasonable that on the outside, we're just sorta like, "Why can't Google figure out, like, how to integrate all this into what it has?" And they have, like, all 2 different labs that were blended into one, and then they're trying to work with people commercializing the technology, which is not what the researchers do. It's incredibly complex, and hearing them talk about it helped me have more empathy for what's happening inside with the researchers.
Yeah, and it helps to hear over the course of a number of conversations how they're not all sure, like, whether we're gonna need, like, another scaling law, or, or whether we basically have everything we need right now to get to AGI. We just, like we said, need more humans focused on the different problems that they're less interested in the labs, or, it's sort of interesting. It's like being in the middle of, I don't know, when Henry Ford just decided to, like, put fire inside metal, right? I don't know, like, everyone was probably like, "What are you insane? Like, what's gonna happen with that? Why are you putting fire inside metal?" But, then, like, these amazing things are happening, and so, like, we're just, like, living in the middle of this revolution, right? This intelligence revolution, and we don't it'll be really interesting for you and I don't know, 10 years from now, to go back and, like, listen to this conversation and be like, "Oh, weren't we
Oh
cute?"
my god, we were so adorable. Oh
Yes.
my gosh. Eating all our pasta and talking to people in Ubers. It will be fun. I mean, it will really be like we talked about, like, Jane Pauley last time with, like, the World Wide Web and how mind blown we all were. But I think it was and this is sort of like a lesson in innovation theory and technique generally. I think it was the same Dwarkesh podcast because I feel like I was listening to it in snippets all
For a
weekend
long
long.
time. Yeah.
Um, but where they were talking about somebody I don't know who's, a famous coder, and they were saying, like, his hit rate of success is, like, 5%, like, almost nothing he does works, but he just does so many different things that he just has a higher probability of coming up with a new idea that does work.
Yeah.
And I guess, like, that's the other thing that stood out to me about that interview, now that we're talking about it, is at some point in the interview, they said something like, "There's this big blockade now." I don't know whether it was paywalls or something. And they were like, "But we'll solve for that."
Yeah.
And that to me was the exact flip of what I hear most lawyers' mindset be, which is, "We'll never solve for this. These hallucinations are baked in. It's all biased. Like, therefore, it's like, we might as well not even continue talking about it." And I thought the split screen of those 2 mindsets is so
Totally.
interesting. Thank you for tuning in to 2030 Vision, AI and the Future of Law. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast and leave a review. Stay informed and inspired as we continue to explore the AI-driven future of the legal profession. We'll see you next time.